Today's story is one of the most spine-chilling and emotional story I've ever told in this channel. So please like and subscribe. It helps me a lot. You guys are turning my life around for the better. At around 8:30 p.m. on December 29th, 1972, passengers at JFK International Airport in Queens, New York, heard an announcement over the intercom that Eastern Airlines Flight 401 to Miami was now boarding. Roughly 30 minutes later, all 176 passengers, including the 13 crew members, were on board, and the crew began their final pre-takeoff preparations. Flight 401 was a recently introduced, highly advanced model from Eastern Airlines, known as the Lockheed L-1011 TriStar. This plane was both technologically cutting-edge and massive, with a seating capacity of up to 400 passengers. Unlike typical jets with 4 seats per row, the L-1011 had 8 seats per row and featured 2 levels. The main cabin was on the upper level where all the passengers sat, while the lower level, accessible via 2 small elevators in the back, housed a full kitchen with ovens and refrigerators, as well as a lounge area for the flight staff. That night, the pilot was Bob Loft, a strikingly handsome 55-year-old with over 30,000 hours of flying experience, a staggering amount. Captain Bob was known for his perfectionism, cool demeanor under pressure, and exuded confidence. After boarding, Bob went straight to the cockpit, located at the front of the plane where pilots control the aircraft. He took his customary seat on the front left, while his co-pilot, 10 years his junior, Bert Stockstill, took the seat to his right. Once both the pilot and co-pilot were settled, the remaining 2 members of the cockpit crew joined them. In most passenger jets, the cockpit typically has only 2 seats. However, due to the L-1011's size, it had 4. One of the last 2 men to join the cockpit was 51-year-old Don Repo, the flight engineer. Despite being a big, strong man, Don was known for his soft-spoken, approachable nature. He greeted the crew and took the seat directly behind co-pilot Bert. The final man to enter the cockpit was 47-year-old Angelo Donato, an Eastern Airlines employee who wasn't part of that night's crew. Angelo needed to get to Miami, so the company arranged for him to travel on Flight 401, seating him in the 4th and final cockpit seat, directly behind Captain Bob. By 9:10 p.m., all pre-flight checks were complete, the passengers were seated, and Captain Bob began taxiing toward the runway. 10 minutes later, at 9:20 p.m., Captain Bob pushed the throttles forward, and the plane took off. A few minutes later, Flight 401 was airborne, heading south over the night skies of New York, bound for Miami. For the next 2 hours, the flight was entirely routine. It was so uneventful, in fact, that one of the passengers, Jerry Esco, wrote a letter to Eastern Airlines during the flight, praising their service and how smooth the journey was. His plan was to mail the letter once they landed, but at 11:32 p.m., just over 2 hours after takeoff, the flight took a dramatic turn. At that moment, Captain Bob began the approach to Miami International Airport. However, when he lowered the plane's landing gear, his co-pilot Bert noticed a problem. The L-1011 jets, like Flight 401, had 3 sets of landing gear, one under each wing and one under the nose. Each set of landing gear had a corresponding green light bulb in the cockpit, which would light up when the gear was deployed and locked in place, ready for landing. But when Captain Bob lowered the landing gear, Bert saw that only 2 of the lights were on. The nose gear light remained dark. Captain Bob and the others in the cockpit immediately assumed the issue was with the light bulb, not the landing gear itself. The plane was new, and everything had been checked before departure, so the odds of a mechanical failure seemed slim. To confirm their theory, Captain Bob retracted the landing gear and then deployed it again, expecting all 3 lights to come on this time. But once again, the nose gear light stayed off. Frustrated, Captain Bob radioed Miami Air Traffic Control, explaining that they couldn't confirm if the nose gear was safely down, so they'd need to circle for a while to figure it out. Miami Air Traffic Control directed Captain Bob to fly over the nearby Everglades, a vast wetland area in Florida, and hold there until they resolved the issue. Once Flight 401 was over the Everglades, flying in a circular pattern, Captain Bob and his co-pilot set the plane to autopilot, maintaining a steady altitude of 2,000 feet and a speed of 200 miles per hour. With the plane stable, Captain Bob and Bert began troubleshooting the nose gear indicator light, which they believed was faulty. They pressed, twisted, and even removed the bulb to clean it before reinstalling it. But the light still didn't come on, and they accidentally inserted it sideways, making it impossible to remove again. Realizing the light wouldn't work, Captain Bob turned to Don Repo, seated behind Bert, and asked him to inspect the nose landing gear directly. To do this, Don had to go down into the hell hole, a space directly below the cockpit accessed through a trap door in the cockpit floor. Once down there, Don could look through a window and visually confirm whether the nose gear was down. Meanwhile, 2,000 feet below Flight 401, 43-year-old Robert Marquis and a friend were searching for frogs in the Everglades, cruising in Robert's airboat. An airboat is a flat-bottom vessel with a large fan at the back, ideal for navigating the shallow waters of the Everglades, which can be just a few inches deep in places. The two men were enveloped in total darkness, with no buildings or people for miles. Their only light source was Robert's headlamp. As Robert scanned the area, he noticed a sudden, massive flash of orange and yellow light erupting from the ground about 5 miles away. The flash vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving Robert intrigued. He turned to his friend, who hadn't seen the flash, and suggested they investigate. Robert fired up the airboat, and they sped across the Everglades toward the source of the flash. After 15 minutes of racing at 40 miles per hour through the darkness, they arrived at the scene and couldn't believe their eyes. 20 minutes earlier, up in the cockpit of Flight 401, Captain Bob had turned in his seat to instruct Don Repo to inspect the landing gear. It's believed that as he did so, he inadvertently nudged the steering wheel with his leg. This minor action was enough to disengage the plane's autopilot, sending the aircraft into a slow descent, though none of the crew noticed. It was pitch black outside with no lights or moonlight to provide any visual cues, so it looked like a void. The descent was so gradual that it didn't feel like they were falling. It felt like they were cruising normally. And the crew was so focused on the landing gear light issue that they missed the alarm, which briefly and quietly warned that they had dropped below their intended altitude of 2,000 feet. Not long after Don Repo descended into the hellhole, the plane crashed into the Everglades. No one on board had any idea they were in danger until the impact. The plane exploded upon hitting the ground, creating the orange and yellow flash Robert Marquis had seen. When Robert and his friend arrived at the crash site, they were the first on the scene. Despite the sound of people crying and screaming all around them, they couldn't see anything. The swampy wetlands had quickly extinguished the fire from the explosion, leaving the area in darkness. Although the plane had hit the ground at over 200 miles per hour, it hadn't struck at a steep angle. The gradual descent and the soft, muddy ground of the Everglades had lessened the impact, saving lives. Many passengers survived the initial crash, but they were left with severe injuries, trapped in the wreckage. When Robert shined his headlamp over the scene, he saw body parts protruding from the ground. Then his light landed on the first survivor, a man whose clothes had been burned off by the explosion, leaving him in just bits of his socks. He was still strapped to his seat, which had fallen forward into the mud, submerging his upper body and face under several inches of water. The man pleaded with Robert and his friend to save him before he drowned. They rushed over, lifted the chair out of the water, and saved his life. But as soon as they freed him, they heard more cries for help. Echoing in the darkness. Robert and his friend did everything they could to rescue as many people as possible, but there were just too many victims and not enough time. About 30 minutes after they arrived, the Coast Guard appeared on the scene with helicopters. They, along with Robert and his friend, spent the entire night pulling survivors from the wreckage. By the time dawn broke the next day, there were no more survivors to be found. In total, 99 people lost their lives in the crash, while 77 survived. Among the dead were Captain Bob Loft, co-pilot Bert Stockstill, and flight engineer Don Repo, who had gone down into the hellhole. Angelo Donato, the fourth man in the cockpit, survived, as did Jerry Escow, the passenger who had ironically written a letter praising the flight. A major investigation followed the crash, revealing that Flight 401 went down due to a combination of factors, most notably human error. The investigation also confirmed that the nose landing gear had been functioning perfectly. The issue was merely a burned-out light bulb. In response to the findings, Eastern Airlines made every effort to compensate the survivors and the families of those who had died. They also made significant changes to their pilot training programs to ensure a tragedy like this would never happen again. But the story of Flight 401 didn't end there. For nearly 3 years after the crash, hundreds of Eastern Airlines employees reported experiencing a terrifying phenomenon. At first, many of them went to their superiors with their stories. But Eastern Airlines quickly made it clear that they didn't want anyone talking about what was happening. Employees who reported these experiences were either sent to see a psychiatrist or were simply fired. Despite the pressure to stay silent, some brave employees who had first-hand encounters with this phenomenon chose to come forward, though they did so anonymously. I'll share with you 2 of the most chilling accounts from these employees. Keep in mind, the names have been changed. In March 1973, 3 months after Flight 401's crash, an Eastern Airlines flight attendant named Ginny was assigned to a flight from New York to Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Working with her was her close friend and fellow flight attendant, Denise. Neither woman had been on Flight 401 when it went down. The plane they were working on for this flight was designated number 318 by Eastern Airlines, and it was an L-1011, just like Flight 401. In fact, Plane 318 actually had some parts salvaged from the wreckage of Flight 401. After the investigation into the crash, it was determined that many parts from Flight 401 were still in good condition. Following rigorous testing to ensure they were safe, these parts were installed on other L-1011 jets in Eastern's fleet. This practice wasn't considered inappropriate at the time. The parts were expensive, functional, and had not contributed to the crash. As the flight progressed, Ginny and Denise, along with several other attendants, began the long process of serving food and drinks to nearly 200 passengers. The crew divided the work. Some stayed in the main cabin on the upper level, taking orders, while others, including Ginny, were on the lower level in the kitchen, preparing the food. At one point, Denise finished taking orders and found herself with nothing to do, so she decided to head down to the lower level to help Ginny. Meanwhile, Ginny had prepped her cart and found herself with some free time, so she took the other elevator up to the main level to check on Denise. The 2 women literally passed each other in the elevators without realizing it. When Ginny reached the main level and couldn't find Denise, she asked the other attendants, who informed her that Denise had just gone downstairs to see her. Ginny immediately took the elevator back down to continue her search. To understand what happened next, it's important to visualize the lower level's layout. When you step off either of the 2 elevators, you find yourself in the middle of a cramped kitchen that runs the length of the plane. On one side of the kitchen is a row of ovens. On the other, cabinets and cupboards. At the far end of the kitchen is a wall with a door leading into the lounge area. The door is slightly off to the side, so from the kitchen, you can't see directly into the lounge. You'd have to walk over and peek through the door to get a full view. When Ginny stepped off the elevator and into the kitchen, it was empty, and the door to the lounge was closed. However, she immediately had a powerful sense that Denise was there, somewhere on the lower level, probably in the lounge. Ginny felt so certain of this that she didn't even bother calling out for Denise or checking the lounge. Instead, she turned to the ovens and began preparing food for the attendants upstairs. As she worked, Ginny kept glancing at the closed door, expecting Denise to walk out at any moment. But as the minutes passed and no one emerged from the lounge, Ginny started to feel uneasy. The sensation that she wasn't alone grew stronger. She began to wonder if Denise was playing a prank on her, perhaps hiding in the lounge or in one of the kitchen cabinets, waiting to jump out and scare her. As this thought took hold, Ginny became increasingly paranoid. She kept turning around, scanning the kitchen and the lounge door, bracing herself for Denise to spring out at any moment. But when Denise didn't appear, Ginny's unease turned into outright fear. She decided to confront whatever, or whoever, was causing her this discomfort. She walked over to the lounge door, her heart racing. She reached for the handle, turned it, and quickly poked her head into the room. It was empty. The moment she entered the lounge, the feeling that someone else was there intensified, sending chills down her spine. Ginny rushed to the back of the lounge, desperately hoping to find Denise hiding behind a chair or sofa. But there was no one there. Terrified, Ginny realized she was now alone at the far end of the lounge, with no one in the kitchen, yet the overpowering sensation of not being alone persisted. She knew she had to cross the lounge, pass through the kitchen, and reach the elevator to escape. Instinctively, Ginny moved to the left side of the lounge, pressing her back against the wall to ensure no one could be behind her. She began inching along the wall towards the door, her view of the kitchen expanding with each step. The whole time she was convinced she would see someone in the kitchen, but when she finally crossed the threshold, it was still empty. Ginny made a dash for the elevator, frantically hitting the button, all the while feeling like someone was right behind her. Finally, the elevator arrived, and she jumped inside, shutting the doors and hitting the button to go up. When the elevator reached the main level, the doors opened to reveal Mildred, another flight attendant, standing right outside. Ginny nearly knocked her over as she exited. Mildred, seeing Ginny's pale, sweaty face, immediately asked if she was okay. But all Ginny could manage was, "I don't know. I can't explain it." Sensing her distress, Mildred didn't press for details. Instead, she led Ginny to the back of the plane, out of sight of the passengers, where they found Denise. Denise looked just as shaken as Ginny. It turned out that when Ginny had gone up to the main level to look for her, Denise had gone down to the lower level in search of Ginny. Denise said that when she got off the elevator into the kitchen, she also felt an overwhelming sense that Ginny was there, even though the kitchen was empty. She checked the lounge, found no one, and was so spooked that she quickly returned to the elevator and went back upstairs. As she was going up, she passed Ginny in the other elevator, but neither woman saw the other. Both women, who had never experienced anything like this before, had nearly identical encounters, just minutes apart in the same space. The similarities were too striking to ignore, compelling them to share their stories. 1 month later, plane number 318, the same one on which Ginny and Denise had their unsettling experiences, was at Newark Liberty International Airport in New Jersey, undergoing pre-flight checks before its next trip to Miami. Once most of the checks were completed, passengers began boarding. As the senior flight attendant, Sis, was counting the passengers to ensure everyone was accounted for, she noticed that their head count was off by one. They had one extra person. When Sis recounted the passengers, she identified the discrepancy. There was an Eastern Airlines captain seated in first class whom she didn't recognize. Given that he was in uniform, Sis assumed he must be deadheading, a common practice where airline employees catch a ride on a flight they aren't working. It wasn't unusual for such employees to board without notifying the crew in advance, so Sis just needed his name for the records. Sis approached the seated captain, who was staring straight ahead, and introduced herself, asking if he was deadheading. But the captain didn't respond. He didn't even seem to register that Sis was speaking to him. She repeated her question, but again there was no reaction. Sis was now standing directly in front of him, speaking clearly, but he continued to stare blankly ahead. At this point, another flight attendant, Diane, noticed the odd interaction and came over to assist. Sis tried one last time to get the captain's attention, but he remained unresponsive. Sis decided to inform the cockpit crew about the situation, leaving Diane to stand by the silent captain. Sis returned with the captain of the flight, George. By the time they arrived at the scene, several passengers nearby had also noticed something was wrong and were watching intently. George crouched down to get a good look at the unresponsive captain, who was still staring straight ahead. The moment George saw his face, he recoiled in shock, exclaiming, "Oh my God, that's Bob Loft." It was the same Bob Loft who had died in the crash of Flight 401. George had known Bob well and recognized him immediately, but before anyone could react, the seated captain, who looked exactly like Bob Loft, vanished into thin air right in front of them. The 6 passengers who witnessed this began screaming in hysteria, unable to comprehend what they had just seen. While George, Sis, and Diane were also shaken, they knew they had to maintain order. They calmed the passengers as best they could and organized a thorough search of the plane, convinced that no one could simply disappear. For over an hour, the crew searched every nook and cranny of the aircraft, but they found no trace of the man. Eventually, despite the unsettling incident, Plane 318 took off, its passengers and crew deeply disturbed. After landing in Miami, George, Sis, and Diane immediately filed a report about the vanishing captain. However, Eastern Airlines did nothing. In fact, the logbook containing their reports mysteriously disappeared. Weeks later, when other employees wanted to review the reports, they were told by higher-ups that no such reports had ever been filed, and the whole thing was dismissed as nonsense. Despite Eastern Airlines' attempts to downplay the incident, rumors of the vanishing captain spread among the crew. Over the next 2 years, numerous other strange and unexplained events occurred on L-1001 jets that had parts from Flight 401 installed. Sightings of the silent captain resembling Bob Loft continued, even witnessed by an Eastern Airlines executive who, after seeing the apparition vanish before his eyes, insisted on a thorough search of the plane. But like before, nothing was found. In another incident, a catering company employee who was loading food onto the plane's lower level saw a man who looked just like Don Repo, the flight engineer from Flight 401, wandering around. When the employee spoke to him, Don turned and vanished. The catering company was so spooked that they refused to re-enter the plane, causing significant delays. On another flight, the pilot and co-pilot heard loud banging coming from the hellhole. When the pilot went down to investigate, he saw nothing at first, but as he climbed back up, he looked into the cockpit and saw Don Repo staring down at him, only to vanish moments later. On yet another flight, a female passenger and coach suddenly started screaming, claiming a man had appeared out of nowhere next to her and then disappeared. She was so traumatized that she had to be restrained in a straitjacket when they landed. Despite the terrifying nature of these encounters, there was at least one instance where the apparition seemed to be helpful. A captain reported entering the cockpit and finding Don Repo, who warned him of a specific malfunction in one of the engines before vanishing. The captain, though shaken, took the warning seriously and had the engine checked. Sure enough, the malfunction was exactly as Don had described. Finally, in 1974, these strange events abruptly ceased. No one knows exactly why, but that year, Eastern Airlines discreetly removed all parts from Flight 401 that had been installed on other L-1001 jets, even though none of those parts were defective. The company never provided an explanation, but after the parts were removed, the sighting stopped.